Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. Today we are looking at the global practice of forced labor in fishing. And joining us from the ILR School in Manhattan is Jason Judd, who is Executive Director of the Global Labor Institute and author of Towards Freedom at Sea, which is a handbook for the detection of forced labor in commercial fishing. Also joining us is Daniel Murphy from London. He is a journalist, a researcher, and human rights advocate working to end forced labor across all industries. Welcome to you two. Thanks so much for joining us on Cornell Keynotes today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
You bet. Viewers, it's going to be Jason, Daniel, and I, but we are interested in your questions. So if you have any, drop them in the chat. I'll be receiving them on this end, and we'll take them somewhat in the order that they come. So thank you so much for that. And heads up, there's going to be a lot of resources shared during this show. I should mention that this is live, but it's also being recorded. So this will post moments after we're through if you want to share this with colleagues or friends afterward. All right, gentlemen. Jason, let's start with you. In commercial fishing and seafood processing, forced labor is widespread. Many quarters of the industry. It's kind of in some ways standard practice in some corners of the world. How do you define forced labor? Let's baseline our conversation with that. What are we talking about here?
Yeah. A good working definition of forced labor, the one we use, is that it's work extracted from someone involuntarily and backed up by some menace of a penalty. That's the official language. Some form of coercion, and that definition's widely accepted. It comes to us from the labor arm of the UN, the International Labor Organization. And the ILO, this UN agency, estimates that there are probably 28 million or so people across the planet in forced labor situations. And of those 28 million, 130,000 are at work in commercial fishing. For us, those are big numbers. Here's just one example of what it looks like in commercial fishing. A worker, he usually men, might be a Cambodian migrant worker heading into Thailand looking for work in construction or fishing, or in Indonesia, a Papuan who's heading to Jakarta, to the port, looking for work, or an Egyptian migrant worker heading to Ireland. It happens all over the world, and he might be told, you're going to be paid X, and that's not the case. Or he'll be told that you'll be given a contract and there's no contract. Or there will be no fees attached to your migration and your work, but that's not true. So there's deception, and deception is one way to get to this notion of involuntariness. So he's been deceived. There's involuntariness in the work, and then he's told you won't be paid for 6 months or a year or until your contract ends, or there's a threat of violence. That's an example of the kind of coercion that workers in fishing who are in forced labor situations often face.
And more often than not, they have little legal recourse, right? They're, sort of, people without countries, in some cases, their citizenship is, is violated. Daniel Murphy, how do you think about forced labor?
Well, definitionally, I think there are a few things that I tend to keep in mind. A lot of people think of forced labor as a situation where it's kind of a binary. It's a black and white. There's chains and locked rooms, or there's no chains and locked rooms. But in reality, I think it's more helpful to think of forced labor as a spectrum, where at one end, there are unacceptable forced labor practices, and at the other end, there's decent work. And often, as I think Jason was describing there, what we see is the cumulative impact of multiple violations of a person's labor rights, eroding their freedom and shoving them along that spectrum to the point where we can consider them a victim of forced labor. But at the same time, it's important to understand that people fall in and out of forced labor. Vulnerability is dynamic, and people have agency. They're not just passive, helpless victims. I think one of the starkest illustrations of that agency from the work I've done is talking to survivors who've made the decision to jump overboard from a fishing vessel and try to swim to a nearby island to exit the situation they're in. And then also for fishing in particular, I think it's useful to bear in mind that you find forced labor victims working alongside people who are not victims of forced labor, and that is especially common on fishing vessels.
Jason, Jed, I want to ask you about the size of operations that we're talking about across the world. Can you describe that a little bit, paint a picture for us?
Well, we're talking about in commercial fishing, we're talking about industrial scale fishing. So vessels that are many hundreds of tons and may have crews of 20, 50, 100. Some vessels may have freezing operations, fish processing operations built into the vessel itself. So some of these are high capital, high dollar operations, and they're often at work in what we call distant water, high seas. In terms of the size of fleets, national fleets, each vessel has to fly a flag. The largest fleet on Earth belongs to the Chinese. There are perhaps half a million or more commercial fishing vessels working the big fisheries all over the planet. We're going to talk a lot about Thailand today. Both Daniel and I have worked there. The size of their fishing industry is it's radically smaller. It's maybe 10 or 15,000 vessels. But everybody does it. That is, every coastal nation is in the fishing business. It could be coastal, small scale fishing, small family operations, 2 or 3 people on board a vessel. But it's really vessels and work at the other extreme that we're most interested in, the large scale, high seas, distant water fishing.
Daniel, in your reporting, you cover human rights in supply chains all over the world with a particular focus on Asia. Can you explain why labor and commercial fishing is so prevalent? Why is it a concern there? What are we talking about in Thailand?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, most of my career has focused on Thailand, and I've been looking at the fishing sector there, and I guess more broadly in the region for over a decade. And one of the things that struck me quite early on interviewing victims and survivors and fishers in the industry was how the characteristics of work in fishing actually elevate forced labor risks. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the ILO indicators of forced labor, you see that several of those are actually basic features of work on a vessel at sea. So, for example, limited freedom of movement or constant surveillance. You can imagine you can't really escape the watch of senior crew when you're in a confined space like a fishing vessel. Isolation, Jason mentioned long haul, distant water fishing, boats going out for months or even years at a time. It's very isolating. And also things like relying on your employer for housing and food because you sleep on the vessel and your employer is feeding you from the vessel stores. And all of these are typically indicators of forced labor, but in fishing, they're inherent features of the work. So I'm not saying that all work in fishing is forced labor, far from it. What I'm saying is that the initial conditions in the industry make people a lot more vulnerable to forced labor practices. And I think that presents a real challenge for workers and employers, the supply chain and law enforcement. It's also the case that a lot of these jobs, as Jason mentioned, are going to migrant workers because nationals, whether they be Thai or UK citizens, tend to spurn this kind of work. It's difficult, it's dangerous. You can get quite dirty doing it. And that need for migrant workers creates additional risks of exploitation and coercion. I think one of the things that really came through from my research was that in Thailand, at least, we imagine a large proportion of workers on those fleets who are falling victim to exploitation as having been trafficked into the situation. We think of it as a trafficking crisis, but actually the research which we have tends to indicate that very few people are trafficked, maybe around 3 to 5% of workers. And actually, most of the time, people are voluntarily entering into the sector. They know they're going to work in fishing, but they subsequently fall prey to forced labor practices. And that may well be linked to their recruitment. For instance, debt, recruitment linked to debt is often used to keep people in situations of debt bondage where they can't leave their job. But often people are voluntarily entering into the sector and then becoming victims.
Are there national or international legal protections that are in place, any that are effective that can prevent or penalize forced labor practices? Jason, Judd, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, at the highest level, and in the broadest terms, there are standards for work in fishing. I mentioned at the top the ILO. They draft and put across norms, standards for work of all types, and the definition of forced labor comes from the ILO. The ILO also has a set of standards for work in fishing. They have a convention that all of the governments around the world are invited to adopt and work into their national law. But the ILO doesn't have enforcement mechanisms. It doesn't have the power to force the U.S. or the Thai or the Peruvian governments to do what's in the convention. So it's really I'd argue it's a useful point of reference, but it doesn't by itself deliver workers who are in forced labor situations in fishing from that plight. So in this sort of vacuum between what the global standard offers and what national law, say in Thailand or Peru or the U.S. offers as protections for workers in fishing, there's a huge vacuum, and scandals about the abuse of workers in fishing. Some of them Daniel has written about. Some of them have won Pulitzers for reporters pulling back the curtain on labor practices in commercial fishing. In response to those scandals, outfits, the buyers of seafood here in the U.S., Walmart, Costco, Cisco, etc., drafted their own set of rules and said all of the suppliers, all of the food processors, all of the vessels, etc., all of the intermediaries who get seafood to us, they're going to have to follow this new set of rules. We call these codes of conduct. It's classic CSR, or corporate social responsibility reaction to this vacuum that I described. But they don't have enforcement powers. They can cut off contracts. They can lean on suppliers. But at the Global Labor Institute here at Cornell, we've done lots of analysis of these systems over the last 30 years. And on the whole, in the aggregate, they don't work. We could talk a little more about this shift from what we call private regulation, these efforts by companies to sort of set a standard and gently, sometimes negligently police it, towards public regulation, actual binding standards that these companies, Costco, Walmart, et cetera, are required to follow.
And Daniel Murphy, given that, what do you prescribe here? What do you think is required to address some of the shortcomings that Jason had just highlighted there?
Yeah, well, I think I'd agree with Jason's analysis. We have the international legal framework which we need, and what's lacking is broader adoption international law and most critically robust enforcement at the national level and regional cooperation. To increase the strength and effectiveness of that enforcement. One area I think I do see a gap is with respect to distant water fishing, long haul fishing, where boats are going out for long periods of time. They're being resupplied at sea by other vessels, and that really elevates vulnerability of workers. And I've focused on a particular form of abuse, which I tend to call gross negligence manslaughter, which is really about this inherently isolating business model of being out at sea for long periods of time, resupplied by other vessels, combining with overwork and a lack of fresh food supplies, and it causing outbreaks of archaic diseases like beriberi, which arises from vitamin B1 deficiencies. So I think we do need stronger regulation in that particular area. We've seen outbreaks of beriberi in multiple distant water fishing fleets, and I think regulations to compel long-haul operators to, for example, stock the cheap medical supplies that can potentially reverse fatal diseases like beriberi is something we could very much do with. In terms of the supply chain, I agree with Jason. I think it's very clear that private regulation underscored by social audit, corrective action plans, it just doesn't work on land. So, in my view, woe betide any business which thinks that that broken model can be applied at sea. What we need is something more ambitious. We need commitment and investment from all tiers of these often complex seafood supply chains. And the buyers and the retailers who are sitting at the top of these chains need to demonstrate real leadership and back those commitments up with their wallets. And include at the same time a self-reflective look on how the purchasing decisions and practices of buyers actively shape forced labor risks within supply chains.
Which brings us to the tools that are at our disposal. Jason, you are the author of Towards Freedom at Sea. This is a handbook that is used for the detection of forced labor in commercial fishing. Two-part question here. And as executive director of the Global Labor Institute at Cornell's ILR School, tell us a little bit about the work that you do. What was the impetus for the publication of the handbook? Who's your audience? Who will use this thing? How does it work? Tell me all about it.
Yeah, I think Daniel, you're in our audience. We might have a few more. The goal is to get the goal was to interpret forced labor detection, this problem of finding workers in forced labor situations in fishing, which, as Daniel was describing, is just different from other kinds of work. It's literally out of sight for governments who are charged with protecting these workers, and therefore out of mind. And the officials, the authorities, who are responsible for cleaning up work, for protecting work, enforcing standards in work, are they're accustomed to visiting a factory or a hotel or even a farm, but fishing is generally outside their experience. So fishing and fishers simply often fall through the cracks. Sometimes it's a problem of the legal framework. The laws that protect workers in a factory don't apply for work on board a vessel. And you need a different approach to find, for example, a migrant fisher who's at work. Let's say he's Sean, he's from Myanmar, or he's from Cambodia, and he's working in the Thai industry. How are you gonna, as the official, how do you identify him? How do you engage with those fishers? What sort of intermediaries do you need? Is a union a place you can go? Is an imam a useful intermediary? So those are some of the questions that we want, that the book is designed to prompt these authorities, these officials to ask. And we describe all that, and then we put into the book a good 8 or 10 tools that they can use in targeting vessels and ports and figuring out how to approach fishers to get the intelligence that helps them decide who's at risk. And then once they've identified a forced labor situation, what do they do about it? And the emphasis in the book is on the technical. How do we help authorities figure out their approach to the problem? That's part of the problem, technical. The other part, and probably the bigger part is political. Do these authorities have permission, political permission, to go after an industry that may be important to the government for other reasons? Because it generates jobs, or because it's politically potent, or it's connected with an important trading partner, China, for example. So in the book which we published with the ILO, the emphasis is on the technical, but the problem is that's all sort of prelude to the real problem, which is how do you win enforcement where the government and the actors are conflicted, are not sure just what they want to do about this problem.
And Daniel Murphy, I should ask you, so how do you think about the handbook? How might you use a tool like this? And maybe what are some other tools that you use in your work, in your investigative research work?
Thanks, Chris. Well, yeah, I really welcome resources like this. Detecting forced labor among fishers can be a real challenge. I think what Jason was talking about in terms of having an understanding of the sector is incredibly important. Something that I learned very quickly is that a need to comprehend how different types of fishing operations shape vulnerability to forced labor. So we have this tendency to think of a fishing boat as just this, this monolithic thing, when actually there's a lot of diversity about how boats out on the water go about catching and landing seafood ashore. And forced labor risks on, a trawler that spends months at sea and is catching low value trash to be churned up and turned into animal feed. The risks on a boat like that look very different to the risks on a day tripping crab trapper that's netting a handsome profit every 24 hours and coming back to shore after 8 hours on the water. So there's a lot of sector specific, I suppose, knowledge that it's very helpful for practitioners, whether they be inspectors or investigators or whoever, to have access to enable them to better navigate conversations with fishers, as well as crew management and the business itself. In my experience, one of the most difficult areas are working hours and payment systems, which can be enormously complex. We see regulations in various jurisdictions that reflect the ILO standard that by imposing 14-hour limits on working days. But in practice, this is really difficult to verify. The point that I used to hear time and time again is that the number of working hours depends on the volume of the catch, which is landed, and that varies day to day, and it's fundamentally unpredictable. And at the same time, a lot of the migrant fishers in Southeast Asia that I've spoken to are coming from low educational backgrounds. Their arithmetic isn't necessarily great. So just answering questions about hours, numeric questions, can be challenging in that respect. And then they might be working in shift patterns where 24-hour periods don't matter. They bleed into one another. They're working at night, or there are sudden surges in working hours because a net breaks and you need to spend 15 hours on deck finding the fault and fixing it. So what all this underscores for me is that practitioners really do need that sector-specific awareness and tools to address, to diagnose and address forced labor in fishing. And this is exactly the kind of thing that the handbook offers.
Well, let's talk about this in practice. Drilling down a little bit further, we talked about this high level, but let's talk about actually who concerns themselves with detection of forced labor. We talked about a little bit at the national, international level, government agencies, legal authorities, harbor masters, right? I mean, who is the target audience? How might they use tools like this, Jason? In creating the handbook, who did you aspire to actually connect with and have people use this?
Yeah, for us, top of the list are the labor inspectorates, and almost every government on earth has a labor inspection service, and for some of them, fishing's just not on the list. It's not on the list of things that they're obligated to look at. So, that's problem number one: making sure that fishing gets on the list, and then, as Daniel was describing, ensuring that the people charged with inspecting work in fishing understand how the industry is put together and how it works and how it differs from the work they're familiar with. So that was one of our goals in writing the book. And the second was to give them tools that they could use in an inspection, in a targeting operation, in the identification of workers who may be in a forced labor situation. But it's more than just the labor inspector. There just aren't that many of them around the world, and they're not the most politically powerful officials in your standard issue national government. And in fishing, their stock is even lower. It's the fisheries ministry, for example, that spends most of its time at the port with the vessels and has the closest connection with the industry. They need an understanding of what forced labor looks like, how to spot it, how to act on it. Marine authorities and navies. In fact, in Thailand, one of the government's first responses when it realized it had a crisis that is a public relations crisis. Global reaction to stories about grave abuses in Thai fishing was to put the Navy on the case, send out warships to intercept vessels. Some of that was for display. It was a sort of superficial show of force, but that's the constellation of agencies that can and should be involved in detecting forced labor and fishing, and then sort of working those cases up into the judicial system so that vessel owners who are engaged in this are held to account. But that's not the end of the problem. We often, when we talk about global supply chains, focus on the supplier, the manufacturer, and they can be made out to be the villain of the story. But often what they're doing and the way they organize work is driven by price, which is set by Walmart in Bentonville and by Costco in the suburbs of Seattle. They set a price or they agree to a price, and there's constant downward pressure on price from big retailers, not just in the U.S., but these are the stories that we hear, and that drives practices out to the sea. So when Daniel says we need to work at this at all levels, I think that's what he's getting at.
I want to ask you about the work that you've done, Jason, in South America, South Africa, working with some authorities directly. Can you tell me what that looked like? Yeah.
So we've done at Cornell. We've done work often with the ILO in South Africa, now in Peru and Ecuador, where there are some of the world's largest anchovy and squid fisheries, and as Daniel noted, in years past in Thailand. And there the authorities are a mix. In some places they're sort of new to this set of problems. In other places they've been at it for years. South Africa is an example of the latter. South Africa, the government ratified this ILO convention on work in fishing and committed itself to inspecting foreign flagged vessels that were putting in South African ports, in Cape Town, for example. And I think it may still be the only case or two. A government, in this case the South African government, detained a fishing vessel. I think it was a Taiwanese flag vessel, on suspicion of forced labor practices, gross abuses of worker safety and health. There were other problems, and believe it or not, this was the first time in recent memory that one government was holding another government's vessel and holding it to this global standard. So it was a big deal, but we haven't seen much of that since. So part of our work and part of the purpose in writing the book was to sort of share these stories, spread these practices, and introduce, for example, the Peruvian labor inspectorate to the example of the South African.
Daniel, tell us a little bit about your work. Similar, same question over to you. Your experience working with officials, authorities in Thailand. What was that like, and what did you find?
Well, initially I spent quite a lot of my effort understanding the practices of the Labour Inspectorate, both from the perspective of the folks actually deployed to the ports, as well as the people sitting in the provincial offices overseeing inspection efforts, kind of who inspects the inspectors type role. Later, I did have more collaboration, formal collaboration, but it was certainly more of an effort to critically understand what was working and what wasn't working. Thailand has actually had pretty decent labor regulations on the books for over a decade now. Only recently it ratified the Work in Fishing Convention, ILO. But prior to that, many of the regulations were actually already aligned with the standards in the Work in Fishing Convention. But despite that, since ratifying that convention and bringing international law, labor inspectors have actually only identified violations on fishing vessels in 0.08% of inspections and imposed penalties in half that again. So that points to a real problem with enforcement. And I think that is complex to unpack. One of the issues which I felt was particularly prevalent was the abundance of paper-based records. And the kind of pedestaling of the paper as the be all and end all of an investigation or even an enforcement action. So you require 14-hour limits in regulation. So your paper timesheets that the vessel operator hands over show that miraculously everyone is working below the legal limit, and the inspectors don't take adequate steps to interrogate that and actually verify that it's true. So you kind of end up with this veneer of compliance, which looks good in terms of the numbers, but actually actively contributes to obstructing people's ability to extricate from forced labor situations. As we've been discussing with the value of the handbook and similar resources, there are all kinds of issues around resourcing and institutional knowledge amongst labor inspectors. As Jason said, they're stretched across different sectors. There often aren't enough of them. They don't have the budgets. In Thailand, they often lacked budget to fuel vessels to go and do inspections at sea, for example. And then there's that lack of specialized training in identifying forced labor, because labor inspectors are responsible for assessing against all kinds of regulations, health and safety, not just looking for forced labor. That's not the only thing that they're there to do. And when you lack specialized training for that, in addition to how forced labor manifests within the fishing sector, it can really detract from robust enforcement. And then I think it's also important to understand that there are structural challenges like migration policy at play here. Advanced economies across the world, they have this very confused approach to policy making, where low-skilled migration is kind of a political hot potato, but we need the cheap labor to fill jobs. So we end up with migration frameworks which actively make it harder for people to move safely, cost effectively, and with dignity. And that makes it easier for unscrupulous people to take advantage. So, for example, in Thailand, it used to be the case that migrant fishers on a work visa were prohibited from changing employers. So, how, if you're being exploited, how are you meant to get away from that situation if it means risking your legal status?
Thank you. I want to go back to when we were talking about tools at our disposal. Are there tools, is there technology that labor inspectors, authorities can use to detect and combat forced labor in fishing? Surely there's some solutions here.
Yeah, it's true, there are. It's easy to get, what's the word? Excessively exuberant about the promise of a new technology. I recall when I was working at the ILO in Bangkok, there was a headline in a story. I think it was National Geographic, and this was in the blockchain mania. Blockchain would by itself deliver forced labor victims from their situations. I mean, it was the headline, but it was absurd. And the argument was, If we can just collect their data, move it into the cloud, lock it up, somebody somewhere can see that there's a problem and flag it up. And disclosure and sunlight will bring this vast, complicated industry into compliance with the law. So I tend to be a pessimist when the tech tool is framed as a solution. In fact, it can be an enormously powerful tool, but it goes in the bag with lots of others. And often the tracing of a supply chain and the tracking of the movement of vessels, for example, all that is, and the targeting that it makes possible is all prelude. And at some point, you have to put a person, a journalist, a union organizer, a labor inspector together with a fisher to get that story and figure out what's going on, and then to take the necessary action. Where there's a union, it could be in bargaining. Where there's clearly a crime being committed, a forced labor violation, the government acts against the perpetrator. But the tech contributes to that suite of tools that make the action possible. But the tech itself is not the action.
Yeah, there you go. We had viewer Max who chimed in a little bit ago talking about the long duration at sea being kind of a baseline indicator. There's some monitoring tools and things that we can use. Daniel, you know a little bit about the tech that's used in this space. What is the state of the art as it relates to this?
Yeah, well, like Jason, I'm still waiting for blockchain and app-based interview tools to rid us of the scourge of forced labor in this sector and all other sectors. But setting that aside, I do think that electronic monitoring is a useful tool within that suite. Keeping in mind, as Jason said, that empowering fishers to collectively claim and defend their rights is really the only way to combat forced labor. But in terms of getting us to that point, we can use satellite data to understand how, not only where vessels are, but how they're moving on the water, which can tell us when they're fishing and when they're not fishing. And with an understanding of patterns of fishing and how long a vessel is deploying nets and when it's hauling nets and landing catch, and especially if we have other data like a crew manifest that tells us how many workers there are on board, maybe contracts of those workers telling us what they've agreed in terms of working hours, that can give us a very good sense of the hours of work on board a vessel. And we've seen some work around developing algorithms that can take that satellite data and estimate working hours for people on board. And that's really useful in terms of inspection targeting for national authorities, because you can just flag vessels automatically that are potentially breaching working hours limits and have them inspected. But it's also really useful in legal proceedings when fishers want to claim in cases of wage withholding or overwork, and they want to fight the paper-based records, those timesheets I was talking about, which the vessel operators put forward with some actual hard data based on reality. So I do think that is one area in particular which holds promise.
Thank you for that. And what you were talking about was pointing to the visual that we had up, which was a relative heat map of durations at sea and so on, using satellite imagery is what you talked about. So I just wanted to kind of call that out for our viewers. Let's talk about worker organization and unionization in fishing. What's the state of that globally? Jason, maybe you can tell us a little bit about where we're at with that, or what you've seen or what you observe.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty low on the whole. Organizing workers in fishing is difficult for lots of reasons. Some of them we've already talked about. They may be at sea for months. They may live in ports. There may be rules against access. So it's not easy. There are places where fishing is very is organized, where what we call the density is very high. Norway, for example. But in Thailand, there's a different tradition, and the percentage of fishers who are organized is very, very small. There's also the legal framework to contend with. To stick with Thailand, most of the fishers are migrants, and they come from Cambodia or from Myanmar, Burma, and the law prohibits them from building and leading their own organizations, their own unions. So they can't build a legal union that allows them to bargain with the vessel owner or at the industry level. That's a problem. But the ITF, which is the global union that represents fishers, has supported organizing by these workers all the same, and they have helped them to build power organizations that are able to get into relationships with vessel owners and with the industry and bargain about pay and bargain about safety. So there is this work happening, but the scale tends to be small given the size of commercial fishing globally, and the fleet, the global fleet is dominated by the Chinese, where organizing rights are nil, don't exist.
Speaking on behalf of our viewers, many may be wondering out there what they can do as individuals, either as consumers or citizens, right? That's kind of the through line to the conversation is human activism in this space. What would you recommend to our viewers who say, what can I do? Jason, I'll start with you.
Okay. I mean, for the handful of shoppers who know this certification from that, you go to Whole Foods and you find what you're looking for. For everybody else, it's hard to know, and that is it's hard to stay away from seafood that may be tainted by forced labor. Here in the U.S., we have introduced over the last decade new rules at the federal level that prohibit products made with forced labor from coming into the U.S. So that regime is slowly being built and tightened, but it doesn't mean that seafood made with forced labor is not widely available in U.S. groceries or served in U.S. restaurants. I think what we could do less as consumers, more as citizens, is back trade policy. Trade policy is not exactly sexy, but back trade policy that says we want rules for our trading partners and our U.S. firms that are buying seafood or anything else around the world. We want rules for them that treat labor rights on a par with investor rights. And that's been happening. We've seen some of that over the last decade or so, and more recently, the Biden administration has built what it calls a worker center trade policy and worked these terms into trade agreements. But I'd argue we need more of that. And there's an example from the European Union. So citizens in the member states of the European Union can back a new set of rules that require the lead firm, the buyer, Tesco or H&M, pick your sector. It requires that they know where the work is being done and under what conditions all along their supply chain. And if they don't know, they can be held liable for that, legally liable. And if they know there are harms to workers or to the environment and they don't do anything about it, then they can be held legally liable. We don't have that sort of widespread regime here in the U.S., but could do. So that's as citizens, there's more we can do to write these rules into the agreements we make between the U.S. and all the countries we trade with.
Your turn, Daniel. So what kind of advocacy would you recommend?
Well, I don't want to just repeat everything Jason said, but yeah, I'm very much inclined to agree. I think as citizens engaging lawmakers and actively showing concern about this issue and support for laws instead of private regulation of the sector is really the way forward. As individual consumers, I think it's really difficult. We really lack the information about working conditions and supply chains, etc., that would otherwise empower us as consumers to make purchasing decisions that signal the market as to what is and isn't acceptable. Yet, even though that's the case, we see laws like the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, which kind of assume that consumers go into supermarkets and have this perfect knowledge and, look up the modern slavery statement of every company before they put the item in the shopping basket. And obviously that's not how people shop in practice. And I think, as a result, we need laws which aren't, putting the onus on the consumer, really. They need to put the onus on the supply chain and ensure require due diligence across the chain, as Jason was discussing that. I'd add that, even when we see claims on product packaging or marketing that can lead us to believe that we're buying a better product, it's often the case that actually those claims are based on very little. We've seen in the past year the Marine Stewardship Council, the blue tick on seafood be implicated in human rights abuses, including forced labor, both on land in seafood processing factories and at sea on fishing vessels. So I think it's always important to be aware of what a certification or a claim on product packaging isn't really offering, and not to assume that because it says it's good for the environment, it's also good for workers as well.
Jason Judd, you're an educator. You're a faculty author of an immersion program that's brought to us by the ILR School at Cornell. You offer an online course and an in-person cohort, sort of hybrid blended education package called Human Rights and Global Supply Chains. Tell us a little bit about that offering, who the audience is, what we might take away from checking out that immersion program.
With Saros Kuravila, who teaches, who built this course with me, we're introducing folks to these issues, human rights and labor, specifically governance of labor in global supply chains. And the first course is asynchronous, and it's introductory. What are these issues? How do they show up in different sectors? What are the possible responses? That course is really aimed at folks who are at work connected to global production. They might be union researchers. They might be sustainable program staff working for a U.S. or European buyer. They might also be government officials who are charged with drafting the rules that I was describing and that Daniel was describing. How do we figure out, how do we sort of separate the sheep from the goats in terms of corporate practices and hold them accountable for what's happening along their supply chain? So a good introduction for all of those people, and then we follow it with an in-person cohort. Professor Kuravila and I go deep on these examples and talk about how they show up in global supply chains and what works to improve working conditions, to advance labor rights around the world.
I want to thank you both for the critical work that you're doing in this space. We didn't call it out earlier, but I do want to mention that we have some resources to share with our viewers. A couple articles and some of the work that Daniel's done in this space. We've got a couple reports, Hidden Chains and Turn the Tide. So if we could share those URLs with the audience, in addition to a New Yorker piece, all focused on forced labor and fishing. Gentlemen, Jason Judd, Daniel Murphy, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Viewers, thank you so much for joining us today. And remember that this is recorded. You can view the recording shortly after this. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today on Cornell Keynotes.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Bobby.